All right. Well, according to my clock on the wall, it is 2 o'clock, and we do like to be respectful of your time and get started on time and end on time or early. But this is our next in our series of webinar Wednesdays. Many of you may have heard about, or this may be your first time hearing about FirstNet and the idea of a nationwide public safety broadband network. There have been several very important developments over the last just couple months. So we wanted to put together this webinar to give everybody both an update and to also let you know what FirstNet is and those sorts of things. It is a very complicated, very large project that'll take years to work its way through the process. So within Virginia, every state was asked to identify a single point of contact, or some people like to call it a SPOC. Our Mr. Spock is Tom Gagnon. Tom works in the Secretary of Public Safety and Homeland Security's office, both as the single point of contact for FirstNet, but also the statewide interoperability coordinator, or SWIC, for the Commonwealth. So Tom is the guy who is going to help usher us through the decision-making process for FirstNet, and is in addition to his responsibilities in the interoperability strategic plan and so forth. So we're very pleased to have Tom on the call today. Tom, I turn it over to you.
All right, Steve, thank you for that very nice introduction. So I'll jump right into it. So for the next 30 minutes or so, this is what I'll go over. This is our agenda. What is FirstNet? What is it not? Some of the expectations that we have for it, and the way ahead, at least through the balance of this year, on what we can expect to see happen. At any time, as Steve mentioned, feel free to ask a question. I'm in no rush to go through this, so if you want to stop before you forget your question, or because it's an opportune moment, feel free to ask me to pause, and we can discuss your question. So I'll start in the beginning. FirstNet started as a concept out of the 9/11 Commission report, specifically a recommendation to have a public safety dedicated broadband network created for the nation. It obviously gained traction with a multitude of public safety professional associations and came to fruition in law in 2012 as part of the 2012 Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act, specifically Title VI of that law, which talked a little bit about 911, talked a little bit about spectrum auctions, which helped finance this. I'll talk to that shortly. But also established within the Department of Commerce an organization called First Responders Network Authority, which we affectionately refer to as FirstNet. So I guess first point I'll make clear is FirstNet is not a private corporation. It is a federal entity within the Department of Commerce who's been tasked with, by the law, is to be sort of a project manager, a program manager for this project, which is going to be a 25-year partnership with AT&T. Right now, they have $7 billion in startup capital, and that is just a fraction of what will be needed. It's been estimated maybe around $40 to $50 billion to create this network, and that's probably subject to change. What they also bring to the table, 20 megahertz of radio spectrum, which will underpin this whole network as it's constructed. And I'll stop there. I'll delve into that a little bit more later in a brief. It's based in Reston, Virginia, FirstNet. Probably have under 300 employees, most distributed across the United States. It's interesting, even though they are a government agency, they have a CEO, they have a president. CEO is a gentleman by the name of T.J. Kennedy, and their president is Mike Poff, and they have their applicable management team. They also have what's called the Public Safety Advisory Committee, the PSAC, 40 members, the SME Advisory Board that provides guidance on their FirstNet's draft policies, procedures, and whatnot. For the state of Virginia, our representative is Dr. Jeff Stern, our state coordinator with Virginia Department of Emergency Management. So I mentioned 20 megahertz of spectrum. And people will go, okay, Tom, well, put that in context. What does that really mean? So these questions I get, I turn around and I send them to FirstNet and now AT&T. And, I've said, okay, give me something I can compare 20 megahertz to. And they kind of scratch their heads. They wrestle with it. What I can tell you is that AT&T, who is the partner now, has currently, they tell us, 175 megahertz of spectrum total across the country. Now, will Virginia have access to all of that? No. It'll be a smaller number, but the point is you add 20 megahertz to a current corporation of 175, it is significant. And for a public safety community, which is still being defined exactly who falls into that bin, who does not, you're looking at a population of maybe 5 to 7 million people. So a rough order of magnitude, 20 megahertz does provide ample capacity at this time for building this network. What is interesting about the AT&T business model that they proposed and was accepted by FirstNet is that when a state chooses to opt in, those first responders within that state will have access to all the AT&T spectrum for that applicable state. So whether it would be this 20 megahertz, which is sometimes referred to as band 14 spectrum, or the other spectrum that AT&T has, referred to as the non-band 14 spectrum, devices that first responders employ on this network would be able to ride across that collective spectrum, both the non-band 14 and the band 14 spectrum. Something that FirstNet and myself always want to make clear up front is that another key point to this discussion is this is not intended to replace LMR. The vision of FirstNet public safety dedicated broadband is to I'm sorry, was there a question? Okay. Is for this network, this LTE network, to complement LMR so that public safety will have two complementary technologies to employ in support of their operations. Now, we are now seeing devices that are coming out, handheld devices that employ both technologies, which can possibly provide better coverage using the two technologies for any applicable locality. And I'm sure a lot of folks on the call are familiar with those devices that are starting to come out. So this slide here, FirstNet network benefits, it's kind of the elevator speech, if you will. It's the bottom line up front. I've already talked to some of this already. I'll get into quality support, priority, and preemption. Quality service, excuse me. I'll get into that later. Apps is another big piece to this. There's really three big components to this. There's the network itself. There are the devices that we'll start seeing come online that are band 14 compatible, designed specifically to ride on this network and be user-friendly to the public safety community. And then the third piece are applications. These apps that will be essential tools providing enhanced capabilities down the road. And really, I guess your imagination is the limit to the different applications that can be designed. And I've got slides to back up all this, and I'll talk to it as we go through this more. Local control, I hit that briefly, but that's something that's probably we'll see further down the road. So in very simplistic terms, a notional description of how this thing's going to lay out. I think we're all familiar with the concept of cores, those servers that support an extended network in the IT world. Across the country, there'll be 6 to 8 of these cores strategically placed that will monitor the security and resiliency of the network, will push updates and upgrades through the life of the network, which at a minimum is forecasted to be at least 25 years, so essentially indefinitely. Now from there, we get into each and every state, and actually every territory in the District of Columbia will be part of this project as well. But for Virginia, now you get into the RAN deployment. RAN is an acronym for Radio Access Network. Don't be confused though, this is not LMR, this is LTE, but it's still, the physics behind it still uses radio spectrum to employ it. That's where we have, the governor has a decision point and we're forecasting it will be Governor McAuliffe, literally the last weeks of his administration, where he'll make what's called the opt-in, opt-out decision, where he'll decide whether we will accept the proposal from FirstNet and AT&T to build the network as they envision it should be built, or he'll opt out and have Virginia conduct its own RFP process to develop an alternative solution with a different partner that will still meet the requirements of the law that I talked about from 2012 and the policies that have been developed by FirstNet, the FCC, and the NTIA. The green band at the bottom is where it really gets interesting, and this is where every locality has a vote, if you will. There is no mandate. I say again, there is no mandate that any locality subscribe to this network. If the locality, for whatever reason, decides that when FirstNet becomes available to their area, decides that they do not want to partake in the FirstNet network, they do not have to. So it's an agency choice. It's a locality choice. So that's just another key takeaway from this brief is localities/agencies have a vote, if you will. They can decide at their level whether to subscribe to it or not. So to give you a timeline for the way ahead, and I know y'all can read this just as good as I can, so I won't belabor it. But in 2 key months, June, right in front of us, we are looking to see a draft state plan proposed by FirstNet and AT&T to be provided to myself and others, and I will talk about those others later, via a intranet portal. They call it the State Plan Portal, and individuals who are given access by FirstNet will be able to review the plan. We will probably have 45 days to review it and provide comments on it. FirstNet and AT&T may or may not take those comments on board. You know, the number one concern I hear consistently is coverage. What does the coverage look like, especially relative to what I have right now? Given all that feedback from us, they may or may not adjust the plan for Virginia. And then September is when they're forecasting to provide the final plan, the final proposal, if you will, to Virginia and by extension the governor to make a decision. Per the law states we have a 90-day clock. Day one starts the first day we get that final state plan. The state has 90 days to review and advise the governor on what our decision should be. The governor then takes that all on board, makes a decision. I already talked about opt-in, opt-out. I'll take opt-out one step forward. If the governor does decide to opt out, he's listened to the subject matter experts. He's gotten some locality feedback, and the plan has some serious shortfalls. And we think there's a chance that we could get a better solution with a different partner for Virginia than itself. He could opt out, and if he does, then we have 180 days per the law. Again, that's fixed. There's no flex on that. We have 180 days to conduct our own RFP process identify a partner, develop an alternative solution, and put it on FirstNet's desk, if you will, on day 80 or day 180. So that is a very aggressive timeline. Some would argue that the law was written in such a way as to discourage an opt-out scenario, but it is what it is. We got 180 days if the governor would decide to go that route. If we opt in, we could look for the early stages of construction to start in 2018. If you opt out, it gets more complicated, and I'll stop there. I've got a slide that talks a little bit more about the challenges of an opt-out. So I mentioned we'll have subject matter experts provide recommendations to the governor. What you see here is, pretty simplistic flow of how we'll vet the first draft state plan, which I see that as kind of our test run, and then we'll essentially repeat the process with the final. Key box to the right there are state agencies that will be involved. They're all familiar to everybody, kind of self-explanatory. The one, though, that some of you may not be familiar with is with the SEEC, the SIEC, which stands for Statewide Interoperability Executive Committee. That committee came back online about 18 months ago. It is comprised of 33 individuals from state agencies, from the regional interoperability committees, key professional associations, who all have an interest in public safety communications interoperability. They will be part of the state level process to provide a commentary on the state plan. So we'll run through that. I'll go through the red process. So the folks in the box do their analysis. I will consolidate that, and that will be briefed out at the governor's level. And with any guidance he has, we'll forward our commentary to FirstNet. And like I said, they may not take that on board. Probably in September is when we see the final state plan. We essentially run through the same process, but now it's for a decision. So the governor, at the end of that process, does make the final call. So I mentioned, AT&T will provide immediate access to its complete collective inventory of spectrum, if you will, 175 plus the 20 as it comes online. So that's kind of the crux of their business model for this. Is on day one, as they put it. Day one would be the day after a state opts in. There's an immediate accessibility to their bandwidth, their infrastructure for the entire country. They quote $180 billion. So obviously AT&T, a huge company, bringing that scale of economics to the table immediately for states that choose to opt in. Devices. Mentioned devices. I'm probably going to brief partially a slide that I have later in here, but it's bring your own device. So not only does the network turn on essentially on day one, but your devices, because most of them would be non-band 14, can immediately ride on the network because the preponderance of the spectrum that is turned on day one is non-band 14. That 20 megahertz of spectrum that I briefed at the very beginning, it will take time to bring that online. So, the vision is a 5-year construction timeline starting in 2018 through 2022. That band 14, 20 megahertz that FirstNet has exclusive rights to and has brought that to the partnership with AT&T. That won't turn on immediately. That will be a phased construction over 5 years. So in the interim, initially, those that subscribe in 2018 would actually their network, their quality of service would be based upon non-band 14 spectrum. That would be kind of segregated or cordon partitioned off to provide a guaranteed quality of service. So opt-in, I talked to that already a little bit. Essentially is if we opt in, if Virginia opts in, it's all on FirstNet AT&T to build this thing, construct it, maintain it, improve it, and market it. It's hands off for Virginia. So, opt-in obviously has, obvious advantages to it. The case is probably clear for most states to opt in. The most poster child for that would be something like Alaska or Montana. Those states with a vast geography that no company or state would be able to generate revenue sufficient to sustain a network in that specific state. Other states like New Jersey, who are highly densely populated, who knows? Maybe it's a different story. For opt-out, as I mentioned earlier briefly, it does get more complicated. So let's assume that a state opts out and over the course of 180 days identifies a partner, develops an alternate plan, and gets it to FirstNet on day 180. It actually is handed off immediately to the FCC. The FCC looks at it specifically for technical feasibility. Will this thing actually work? Not only will it work now, but will it be sufficiently upgraded over the next 25 years to maintain technological parity with the rest of the world? So as the rest of the world migrates to 5G, will you be able to migrate to 5G at the same time? That is a requirement, so that's another challenge. If a state were to opt out, they need to accept that responsibility to keep their network up to the latest technology, just like the rest of the nationwide network. If the FCC accepts the plan from a technical standpoint, then the NTIA looks at it from a sustainability, a financial standpoint. What is your business model? Now, AT&T, FirstNet's business model for their solution, their network solution, is for it to be self-sustaining. In fact, that was the vision when the law was written and passed, was this would not require a burden on the taxpayer, that through subscriber fees, through the monetization of excess capacity, that this thing would be able to sustain itself. When I say monetize excess capacity, I'm talking about, so let's say the network is built, the 20 megahertz of band 14 spectrum is operational on a quiet day in any state or locality where that full 20 megahertz of capacity is not being employed. AT&T, who is a private company driven by the bottom line, they can monetize a secondary spectrum by subleasing it to another carrier, or they can use it as to the benefit of their current customers to improve their quality of service. If the NTIA approves the plan from a business model perspective, a sustainment perspective, then it finally gets back to FirstNet, who is the keeper of that 20 megahertz of spectrum, and then the state requests to have exclusive rights to lease that bandwidth for their state. So that's, in notional terms, how we would go through an opt-out scenario. 3 federal agencies involved. Now, at any time through the process, the state does not meet the standard of any of those 3 agencies, you automatically fall out of the opt-out vetting process, and you fall back into you become in effect a default opt-in, and you fall into the opt-in bin, and then when the state gets built out, along with the other opt-in states, that's to be determined. Some have speculated that you would fall at the end of the line. Others have speculated that, well, if you were a revenue-generating state on the East Coast, that even if you were one of those opt-out folks that fell out of the process, that you may actually move further in line in the opt-in category just because of your economic, your revenue potential. let's talk a little bit about functionality. Mentioned briefly, I held off because I knew we'd get to this. So, priority preemption. I mentioned the term quality of service. Quality of service. What does that mean? Well, right now the RFP and now the proposal from AT&T calls for 4G LTE with migration to higher levels, 5G, 6G, so on and so forth over the next 25 years. Call completion is, I want to say, 99.99% of the time with zero latency. Priority means that you're guaranteed at that level of service, that quality of service as a subscriber. Preemption means, let's say, those secondary customers that were allowed to ride on the excess capacity of the 20 megahertz. If the public safety traffic grows to such a point where quality of service is jeopardized, those folks either can't initiate a call, or as what's referred to as ruthless preemption, they can be literally pushed off that 20 megahertz of spectrum. Now, AT&T has given a commitment that, let's say, public safety exceeds that 20 megahertz of band 14. Now that video is becoming more prevalent, I mean, there's some out there that would suggest that we could crush that 20 megahertz of capacity given some extreme scenario. AT&T is committed to then expanding exclusive access for that event for public safety to their non-band 14 capacity. Again, going back to their argument that collectively they're going to have 195 megahertz of spectrum aggregate across the country available to the nation's public safety population. So the full capacity and resources of AT&T, they claim, will be available to public safety. The next few slides kind of go through it in very simplistic terms using the analogy of an interstate. So right now, this is our current situation. We're dealing with the general public competing for the same bandwidth for our devices. Let's say Virginia opts in and localities can subscribe to FirstNet. Day one, they're guaranteed a certain quality of service, and that's depicted, they're going to have their own lane, if you will. They'll be guaranteed to go a certain mile per hour, 24/7 on that bandwidth. Things get busy. Those secondary customers that are allowed to ride upon that excess capacity on a normal day, they're not allowed to use it anymore. They're forced to exit from that 20 megahertz of bandwidth, and it's dedicated completely to public safety. Then you could take it one step further and get into something called local control. And I like to try to really put this into context so that folks don't belabor this any more than it has to be. Local control essentially allows public safety internal to itself or an applicable region or locality to prioritize who has access to the spectrum. The mechanics of that are still being worked out, and it'll take a while, in my opinion, to really sort it out. And I won't go any further than that. So this is, again, I think this is something a little bit further down the road, but it provides an enhanced level of dynamic capability to manage the spectrum if things get very busy for a locality. The classic scenario that FirstNet will use will be the plane landing on the Hudson, or you literally had hundreds, if not thousands, of first responders converging in possibly an area managed by a handful of cell towers. That's like the classic scenario. So where you could see this would probably be in our more urbanized areas like the national capital region. So I just wanted to, I think that's a good, how I explain it is just a good way to put it in context and to let you know that it's out there. If you hear about it, you kind of have some basics on it. But I think it's going to be more the extreme exception than the norm. mentioned bring your own devices. The takeaway here is, and I had a call from Culpeper County, and they said, look, we're looking to buy new handheld devices. What do you recommend? With FirstNet right around the corner. So I got with FirstNet, and the guidance literally was, we recommend they buy a device that has the Band 14 chip already in it, which there's not a whole lot of options out there right now. That will probably change radically in the next couple of years. But because if we opt in on day one, after the governor opts in, AT&T claims we will have access to all their capacity, then the theory is that a locality can subscribe with the devices that they're using today.
Hey, Tom, a quick question on that.
Yes, sir.
Bill Hunter from County of Roanoke. So do all carriers now support all other carriers' LTE bands? And is that why you can use any device?
That's my understanding, that they can from a technological standpoint, and they have agreements to allow roaming. Now AT&T, if you subscribe to FirstNet, how it was explained to me, was you will be able to roam on other carriers' capacity networks if you need to get connectivity. However, you will only have the priority and preemption on AT&T spectrum. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and then the local control piece that you're going to come back to later. I've got some other questions on that, but we'll save that for another Wednesday webinar. But yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's a lot of it's TBD. A question you'll get: well, what happens when the feds, the state, and the locals roll up on the same event? Who has priority? And the quick answer AT&T will give you is, well, you're all going to be treated the same. Well, wait a minute. You just told me. Yeah, exactly. So without me struggling here trying to answer questions that, frankly, I'm probably not prepared to answer because they haven't given me the information yet, I would say I've given you some context, some basics on local control, but a whole lot more to follow on that. Any other questions at this point? Okay. Security is another big one. I just put the slide in here to let you know that FirstNet and AT&T understand that this is a deal breaker. If you cannot provide a level of comfort with subscribers that this thing will have adequate security and resiliency, then they're not going to subscribe. So they read that loud and clear and understand that is inherent to this whole thing being successful. I talked about applications. So FirstNet is developing, kind of setting the stage for industry to start developing applications. The first one that pops to mind is, for our fire services, they would like to have location apps that show not only an X, Y, but a Z access for vertical structures to track their personnel. So, one of the big three pieces of this, and really to gain the full potential and actualize the full vision of FirstNet, you've got to have great apps that people can use on the network, on the devices. So the FirstNet has stood up if they haven't already, it will happen soon, a research and development laboratory in Boulder, Colorado that will certify all devices and all applications from industry before they're allowed to be sold as something that can be used exclusive with the FirstNet network. They're going to look for, obviously, certain standards, resiliency, security, to the ICANN federal standard. They're developing platforms that developers can use to develop these applications. Local control, cloud services. So a lot of this stuff looks familiar to folks. And again, to really reach the full potential, we've got to have some great apps that people can use. What is public safety grade? The best definition I can find, if it's possible to put it in one sentence, was published by NIPSTIC in 2014, but people come back and argue that, and I'm sure rightfully so, that it doesn't cover everything, doesn't adequately cover the network itself, the devices, the applications. So I think that's still in development, and we're still grappling with, okay, what does public safety grade mean to you relative to X? So still TBD on that as we get into this and FirstNet becomes reality and continues to mature over the years. But there are certain things we all can agree upon. We need hardened devices, network resiliency, redundancy, protection from cyber and physical attacks, stricter standards for security, privacy, and whatnot. One thing they do talk about, so when agencies, if they do decide to subscribe, bring their own device, they talk about siloing, where apps that have nothing to do with public safety would be siloed and not able to cross-pollinate information with public safety dedicated applications that may be loaded to that phone. What pops to mind is your volunteer firefighters. Most of the fire services obviously are volunteer. We want those folks to subscribe. They will be able to subscribe. They'll be able to use their personal devices on FirstNet. They will be every device, without getting too technical, I'd rather not, because I don't have all the lingo down, but essentially every device has a unique identifier, kind of like a portable radio, and you can register that device to have access to the FirstNet network. And so that will enable folks to literally have their own personal devices that they use on a volunteer status to receive notifications of calls for service, to have their phones part of the FirstNet network. At a minimum, when they're on duty responding to a call. Again, I think that's still being worked out too. Coverage. Coverage is the number one concern. I briefly mentioned that when we want to get locality feedback on the state plan. It's consistently brought up as probably the number one issue when I go out there. The next few slides talk to coverage. There are some, I'll just call them caveats that I'll bring to your attention just to manage folks' expectations as we see this thing built over the next 5 years. So we've been informing the coverage baseline through a few different data submissions, first in 2015 and 2016. The takeaway from this slide is the gray, blue, and green areas are, at a minimum, within the RFP, it was requested that they have 24/7 public safety dedicated broadband access coverage. The light gray, almost white areas are what's referred to by FirstNet as on-demand or non-terrestrial coverage. And this concerns a lot of people, frankly. So you look at Highland County up there, in that small horn, if you will, button up against West Virginia. A lot of that is the light gray, almost white, on demand. So what that means is, unless something happens there that requires public safety support, i.e. a fighter jet crashes in the national forest, the preponderance of that county won't have 24/7 public safety dedicated broadband. Well, when a sheriff's deputy or a firefighter or EMS, etc., is responding immediately to a no-notice event, they don't have time to wait for a drone or a portable tower to be set up. So that's a huge red flag. And the other thing I would propose is, while there may not be a whole lot of activity there, I'll bet you, for the people involved in that situation, it's a real big emergency to them, and they really want the full resources of public safety at their disposal to help them out of their situation. So, again, that goes back to our commentary opportunity, where we need to talk about when we do get access to the coverage maps that AT&T proposes, we need to look at them closely and provide commentary on that. You may be aware of, I did send out a letter last week to the county administrative officials, CAOs, and the city managers for our 36 independent cities and towns, requesting them to identify one individual for each respective locality to review the state plan and comment on, number one, the coverage and capacity and probably the cost schedules for the services at a minimum. I am compiling those names literally as we speak. The emails are rolling in. I'm very happy to see the strong response. My plan is to hand that to AT&T and FirstNet in Dallas next week when they have a meeting with us, with all the states actually, and have them register those folks who have access to the plan. The last time I met with AT&T and FirstNet, they were supportive. But until it happens, I'm not going to say it's going to happen. So, but at this point, they seem to be supportive. I do have the support of my leadership. Next week, Secretary Moran, Deputy Secretary Curtis Brown, myself, Steve Marzoff, representing VITA, obviously, and Charles Warner from VITA will be part of that group going out to Dallas next week. The next slide kind of looks at coverage a little different, to me, it suggests that FirstNet's focus is on the highly urbanized areas and interstates where you already have the tower infrastructure in place, and it's relatively easy to hang a band 14 antenna on those tower versus going into green or light gray areas and constructing new towers. It goes back to their business model. This thing has to sustain itself. So, in my opinion, they're going after low-hanging fruit. They want to get to the more densely potentially high subscriber areas to get that revenue coming in. So that goes back to my comment. Just a caveat. If you said, Tom, when do you think it's coming to my locality? I would say, well, it's a 5-year build-out plan at a minimum. And if you're not in a significant town or city or along an interstate, it could be later than sooner. So just food for thought. This is interesting. I've got to brief this slide every time I get a chance. Again, kind of managing expectations. So back in 2012, when FirstNet first stood up, they had to come up with a definition to define what is a rural area versus a urban area. Well, they went through all the federal statutes, and there's actually several definitions out there that delineate between rural and urban areas. They came upon a definition in the 1936 Electrification Act. Now, in their defense, the definition has been updated over the decades, but the bottom line is that definition defines almost 98% of our country as rural. So what does that mean? What that means is, in my opinion, the FirstNet set the bar very low for meeting rural build-out benchmarks. The statute, if you were to take the time to read through it, does state that any network construction plan will have an annual rural benchmark for the 5 years. So at the conclusion of every year, the 5-year construction plan, a certain percentage of rural build-out needs to be completed. Here's the other problem. Well, what is the goal? What is the final? What is 100%? What is the 100% rural coverage goal? Is it 1 million square miles? Is it 500,000 square miles? I don't know. And until we see the state plan, we won't be really able to quantify what it means for rural coverage build-out for Virginia. But I want, again, another, just teasing out some things that I've seen that I share with people. The bottom line is, do not think that this is going to be a silver bullet to solve your LTE coverage challenges for public safety in the first year or two. It could take some time. So, as we have an ongoing conversation with FirstNet and AT&T, what you're looking at here, and I'll actually start with the graphic to the right. That's a screenshot from an interactive map that I have on my website. You've got the link there if you do want to check it out. I wouldn't spend a lot of time on the website. We're going to update it. I've got a project underway with VITA to do that, but the interactive map is still a good tool, and it's the link to it is at the very bottom of the first page. And you can drill it down into your locality. The green areas goes back to that coverage baseline that FirstNet's asking AT&T to provide 24/7 coverage, LTE coverage. The red is that on-demand or non-terrestrial area. Now this is a baseline. Hopefully, there's going to be a lot less red than what the baseline shows. That AT&T coverage will be better, but this was the minimum within the RFP to meet. Now to the left, that's another screenshot, and that's actually a screenshot of Louisa County. And what we did is we took 1 year of PSAP call data from Louisa County, and we overlaid it on the baseline coverage map, and to show potential gaps or coverage gaps that could be an issue or are an issue. And this is kind of epitomizes that, where you obviously have a road network with significant calls for service over a 1 year timeline, and it's not covered in the coverage baseline within the RFP. So that's a gap that we want to communicate to AT&T. So these are the things, I have call data for probably close to 50% of the PSAPs to date. If you don't have the ability to do this type of analysis, I can work with you and VDM, who has some great GIS folks, to convert call data into GIS-friendly information where we can do this type of overlay to highlight coverage gaps to better inform conversation with AT&T. So just throwing that out there as a tool that you can utilize. This is Amelia County, obviously, and again, another example of, a coverage gap along a road, significant activity. Now, if you were to blow this up, if you were to drill into it, the red dots would grow. So this is not like, obviously all the calls for 1 year. It would, as you magnify it, the red dots would multiply. So that is, very basic overview of FirstNet, and I'm now at minute 46, so I don't know. Steve, how am I doing on time? Do I technically have an hour?
Absolutely.
Okay, all right. I don't want to abuse my time here. So I'll pause for a moment. Are there any questions on FirstNet? Okay, either I did a really good job or people are overdosing on FirstNet. So I'll move along. The last few slides are just kind of an outreach update on where we're at. I already talked about the SEEK. I won't belabor that. Ongoing high-level discussions. We had FirstNet AT&T down within the last 2 weeks to talk to several of our secretaries, Secretary Moran, Secretary Jackson, and a few others that joined in. Folks that will advise the governor when he needs to make a decision. So they're being brought up to speed. Locality outreach is ongoing. If a locality says, hey, can you come out and give this brief to our Board of Supervisors, to our public safety leaders, to anyone, I will never say no. So if there's interest, my contact info is on the last slide. I've gotten out to the RPAC guys, our regional interoperability groups. We're now hitting the localities. Kent Emerson, disregard that. He's a point of contact, I think, maybe for Danville. But the idea is to get out there, grassroots, and keep people up to speed. So there you go. Just a real quick update on what FirstNet is, the way ahead for the balance of the year, and just my availability to come out. One update on the slide, if you have not heard, Carol Adams, who did a tremendous job helping me and really made outreach possible. She was afforded a wonderful opportunity with Motorola, and she has transitioned to them, and she's got my full support. So I'm kind of back to being a one-man show right now. But if you call me or someone from your locality come out, I won't say no. We'll figure it out. I'll get out there sooner than later to provide what I know on FirstNet. So, Steve, thanks for the opportunity. Melissa, I really appreciate it. And barring any questions, that's all I have today.
Any questions for Tom? One thing that I'm sorry, go ahead.
Tom,
Bill Hunter,
go ahead, Tom.
All right. There were two people who had questions at the same time. One of you go ahead right now.
This is Derek with Region 4 RPAC-I Chair and with Tazewell County 911. Tom, I know we've talked a little bit the big impact to the smaller rural areas. Could you please resend out the information and offer support for the smaller PSAPs to try to submit the information to you? Because I think, to me, I see it a very big advantage to show with our FirstNet proposal or review to show, yes, we agree with some rural areas that can be left as non-terrestrial 24/7 coverage, where, wait a minute, here's a couple areas that we definitely need the 24/7 coverage. So if possible, your offer there, if you could send that back out to everybody, I'll work in our region to make sure we can maybe get that information to you somehow.
Okay, what I'll do is I will well, let me ask a question. What's the best way to get this word out to the group? Is there like a 911 point of contact list that I can get?
Steve Marzoff. We have a email list that goes out to all the PSAP managers. Plus, we can send it out to our regional coordinators. They have really good contact lists at each locality, so we can take that as an action item as a follow-up to the webinar. We can go ahead and just say there was a request that we send this out, and we can help you do that. So if you can get it to me, I'll get it to the regional coordinators. We'll get it out there to the PSAP community.
Super, Steve. So I'll draft up the email. I'll just send it to you then.
Perfect.
Okay. Cool.
There was somebody else who had a question other than Derek?
Bill Hunter, County of Roanoke. Any idea, Tom, on when we're going to get the first crack at seeing the state plan to begin our review?
I would hope, well, you're going to, because we'll only have 45 days, it'll have to be in July. Now, I'm told the state plan will not exceed 80 pages. That's what I'm being told. So, I mean, theoretically, if you've got time on your hands, you could read the whole thing and provide comment on whatever you saw fit. Now, a big caveat to this is every time if I'm able to get everyone permission that's requesting it, all the counties, cities, the user, the person who has access to the portal, will have to agree to a 4-page terms of use agreement. And basically, you promise AT&T and FirstNet that you will never, ever divulge a single word of this plan to anyone, that it's for your eyes only. This is not a group discussion for the locality. This is picking someone that has the complete trust and confidence of your locality's public safety to review the plan by themselves in their office and make their best judgment call on what the plan proposes. So you can't divulge it to anyone else. You can't print off anything. You know, this is kind of like, you know, top secret, you know, this is like classified information, you know, that, you know, anyone's been in the military or, you know, seen on TV. It's for your eyes only, literally. And they will, they in no uncertain terms state in their user agreement, they will use the full resources of their legal department to go after anybody who divulges, you know, their secret coverage maps, so on and so forth. So I'm going to make that very clear to everyone. I will send out a guidance package to advise folks that are given access to this information on how they're to safeguard it and to review it. And quite frankly, after I read the 4-page disclaimer, terms of use, I was kind of like, wow, somebody else wants to do this instead of me. Maybe that's okay. I mean, it was just like, man, this is serious stuff. So according to AT&T, this is unprecedented, allowing this level of accessibility to their proprietary information. So when I say right now they are supportive of this concept of user access at the local level. They may talk to the lawyers next week and may backpedal on that. But the last time I met with them, they were supporting this concept, and my leadership is pushing for it. The theme with FirstNet in Virginia has been an inclusive, transparent, collaborative vetting process. And my leader, Deputy Secretary Curtis Brown, I'm assuming up from there support that philosophy. So I'm going to do the best I can. So,
well, just as a follow-up, I certainly understand AT&T's position on that, but doesn't that give pause to the whole plan that you're partnering with a commercial entity to try and pull this all off?
Yes, and I've kind of turned it around on them to get them to support our concept is, well, wait a minute, you've been touting this as some unprecedented partnership with government and public safety, and you've been touting the benefits of a public-private partnership with a corporation versus government trying to build this itself. To make this a true partnership, you're going to have to allow unprecedented access to gain that confidence of the states to subscribe to it. And that's my opinion, but I think it registered with them. Like I said, when I met with them last, they were supportive of what I told them would be our request to allow counties and cities, towns to have at least one person designated to review the plan.
And this is Steve Marzoff. I would add too that, in my opinion, since we're sharing, is that a lot of this system may end up just being another feature set available from AT&T, and it may be quite possibly be available through VITA's contract or Fairfax's contract with AT&T. And ultimately, this will boil down to a choice a locality will make between AT&T and FirstNet and Verizon or T-Mobile or Sprint or anyone else. And it really is just it's a federally negotiated level of service that AT&T has agreed to provide, both with their coverage, with their priority access, and all those other things. So some localities may still choose to continue with a current provider. They don't necessarily have to, and I think that's one of the key takeaways that Tom mentioned, is you don't have to. Opting in does not mean we're going to buy. Opting in means that AT&T and FirstNet will build out the network in Virginia without the responsibility being with Virginia to build it out. And, then you can make a choice. You don't have to consume this. You can continue with whoever other service type provider or building your own public safety network, data network if you were so inclined to do that. But it gives you an option and it gives you an opportunity to see what goes into the service that's being provided. Are there any other questions for Tom today? Well, I want to thank you, Tom, for doing the presentation of the webinar today. This is a very fast-moving and complicated issue. There are a lot of sections that are going to be in this plan, and I was actually just looking at it, the outline of the plan today, and there are quite a few sections of it that aren't Virginia-specific. There's a lot of it that's going to be a national architecture and a national cybersecurity and those sorts of things. The only parts that are really going to be specific to Virginia are those coverage issues. So there's going to be some difficulty in negotiating some of those things that impact the entire nation and not just Virginia. And that's something I think we're going to have to, that we're going to continue to wrestle with, because this isn't being built for us. It's being built nationwide. And, that definitely limits, I think, our ability to get special accommodations to meet unique requirements in Virginia. If there aren't any other questions before we go, thanks again, Tom. Thank you all for participating. We will have future webinar Wednesdays and be sending out announcements for those in the coming week. And the recording of this will be provided on our website in a couple of days. Thanks, and have a great day, everyone.
Okay, thank you.